Since his removal from most major social media sites, former President Trump has relied on releasing personal statements titled "From the Desk of Donald J. Trump," essentially a blog that readers cannot comment on or really engage with in any other way than reposting to social media. According to data compiled by BuzzSumo, quote, Trump's new blog has attracted a little over 212,000 engagements, while a single Trump tweet, for comparison, was typically liked and retweeted hundreds of thousands of times.
Editor-in-chief at The Real News and host of the Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and co-host of The Real Line podcast, Marshall Kossoff, they join us now to discuss. Marshall, I am just struck by how low those numbers are in comparison to what he used to get. Obviously, it's not all that surprising given the ubiquitous nature of Twitter, but it still is stunning to see in terms of what even a former president can command when he's deplatformed.
I mean, the thing that's fascinating here is that Trump is sort of stuck in a really, it's unclear, like chicken or the egg situation, because part of the reason why Trump's tweets would get so much engagement is that they were the news. Like, he could send a tweet and that would actually make the tweet more important because he sent it, which then created a nice virtuous cycle for him. And he would tweet and then that would make news and people would cite the tweet in the news, then it'd go on and on and on and on. So now it's not just that as a result of him not being present and him just frankly not being the president or having as much power, it just doesn't really matter. A statement by Trump doesn't have the same degree of influence that it had. And I'll just make a guess that even if he were still on Twitter, just because he's not president and just because the way, frankly, like the type of news or the type of content he tries to put out, he still would not be getting quite as much engagement with folks, unless he's maybe tweeting something about Liz Cheney.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, Max, have been surprised how much he has fallen out of the national conversation. But what did you make of these numbers in particular?
Well, as the editor-in-chief of a media company that's constantly struggling to get people's attention, in one way it's not surprising because it's very hard to do that, and the deck in a lot of ways is stacked against you if you were not kind of controlling some sort of mainstream medium, right? But I think that I'll be honest, right? That this week at least, right, I've been so kind of consumed by the, horrific, news of apartheid violence in Israel, the COVID crisis in Brazil. The governor of Connecticut just called in the National Guard to break the longest running strike right now in the U.S., that I haven't really been thinking about this. And those two things are connected, right? I mean, we were always talking about Trump was a distraction. And so I think one of the first things that struck me this morning was man, I haven't been thinking about Trump, and that's really profound after kind of 5 years of really thinking of nothing but Trump in a way. But I think what Marshall and Sagar said really hits the nail on the head. It's the question of engagement, right? What do we mean when we say engagement, and what does that tell us about the political power that Trump actually held, right? And this is something that we've talked about on this show, right? My long-running thesis that what Trump did for people was that he at least empowered people to feel like they had some sort of power over each other, a cultural power, right? Yep. They could own the libs. They could own people online that they hated. They could use Trump as a cipher to enforce a sort of cultural order on people that they did not like. In a world in which we are so regularly disempowered, that modicum of illusory power really counts for a lot. When you just have Trump putting out these blog posts, but you don't have a mechanism for people to engage with it in that way that makes them feel empowered by his message, that allows them to engage with the people that they hate, that they want to use this power against, then you kind of suck Trump's allure away from him. And so I don't think that sort of power complex is going to go away. I think that someone could replace Trump who is still on social media, but in a way this kind of tells us that was always the linchpin of his political power.
What do you think, Marshall?
So true.
Do you think that's true? Do you think anybody could replace Trump?
I don't think anyone can because it's a super obvious point. Trump is singularly unique. He spent 40 years at the center of American popular culture. Just the existence of The Art of the Deal as a business bestseller in airports for literally a 20, 30-year period, and that apprentice, it just matters. And there are people who are clearly setting themselves up to be the successor for Trump, people like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He doesn't have that relationship. He's a politician, and politicians are never going to be able to fill that single space. anyone whose entire relationship with like the party and with the people is basically just the fact that they were elected to an office or were trying to get elected, they're not going to be able to be ubiquitous in that sense. By contrast, and he's not going to do it, but think of the way that Elon Musk just dominated Twitter with SNL last weekend. That is the type of person who could fill that same role to the same degree. So it's really, if you're a politician, what you should be thinking about right now is how can you merge your political ambitions with your pop culture ubiquity, with your presence in the space, with your presence in the zeitgeist. And most politicians who come up with the system right now, they're just not going to be able to pull that off. So no one's going to try to beat Trump. Ron DeSantis is not literally trying to beat Trump despite the hand signals. But other than that, you just have to think about where this is going to come from.
So not seeing the promise in Caitlyn Jenner then, I guess, Marshall, is the big takeaway there. Max,
sorry.
No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Well, I mean, that's actually an interesting point, which is that if Caitlyn Jenner weren't a boomer-con and completely unrelated to California, that is an example of someone who hypothetically would have had the ubiquity to do this. A good example is like whatever, a more democratic member of the Kardashian family.
Interesting. Max, the other thing that I think about here is like something you were getting at, which is the power of the platform itself, which is something that Trump really did understand. He understood it with the tabloids. He understood it with his book. He understood it with his regular Fox and Friends appearances. He understood it with Twitter. That the fact that you're on those platforms and you're meeting people where they already are gathering is actually extraordinarily important. And even the most almost powerful person, one of the most well-known people on the planet, can't get around how important those platforms are. I was reminded of back at MSNBC when Keith Olbermann was there, and he leaves MSNBC. He's one of the biggest names in cable news. He was certainly their juggernaut. When he leaves, is fired. I don't remember exactly how that all went down technically. Goes to current TV, instantly completely irrelevant. Completely just erased. This guy who had a huge fan base, one of the biggest names in cable news, just gone. And now you see that with Trump, like, here's this guy who has a genuine following, enough to become president of the United States, enough to almost get reelected president of the United States. And once he's gone from these major mainstream platforms, he's not completely invisible, but there is so much less of him. It is actually astonishing.
It is. I mean, and there's a lot in kind of who Trump is and what Trump's history is that I think can kind of help us understand this, right? I think that Marshall is exactly right, that it's like no politician traditionally defined is going to be able to fill those shoes. If those shoes are going to be filled, it's going to come from someone who is more in the cultural realm, right? Who commands that sort of cultural power in the way that Trump has been able to do. But then we start talking about the dynamics of that cultural power, which Trump himself, as we said, has experienced kind of multiple evolutions of over the past decades, right? I would say the one place that has historically been more unkind to people, celebrities and their reputations than Washington, D.C. is Hollywood, right? In our lifetimes, we know how quickly the spotlight can leave someone. And we have seen so many examples of people who thought that they were so big, that they were too big to fail, that the spotlight would never leave them because of how much popularity they commanded. But in a sort of kind of hyper-capitalist kind of system where we are constantly moving from one hot thing to the next, everyone is humbled by that sort of cycle, including someone, which we're kind of seeing potentially, who was the most powerful person in the world and sort of combined these two kind of axes of cultural and political power. The platform that he was using to do that has the power, just like the mainstream media did for Hollywood celebrities in the past. It has the power to sap that sort of limelight. And that, it's probably one of the biggest kind of questions of our day of like what that actually means for all of us kind of going forward politically.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have some theories about who can fill that void, but everybody knows it. That's another panel for another day. Okay, thanks guys.
Great to see you guys. Next up on Rising, we've got the great Brianna Joy Gray. She's going to join us to talk about Senator Warren's political future and her new book, When Rising returns.